November 15, 1965, the port of Quy Nhon, South Vietnam. Dawn broke grey and humid over the South China Sea, casting pewter light across the harbour, where the USNS Core sat heavy in the water, her converted flight deck bristling with cargo cranes and loading equipment. The air hung thick with diesel salt spray and the acrid smell of hot metal baking under the tropical sun. Waves lapped against the ship's rust-streaked hull, while Vietnamese dock workers prepared for another day of unloading the machinery of American warfare. Palm fronds rustled beyond the concrete breakwaters, and somewhere in the distance, a radio played Motown melodies that seemed impossibly distant from this sweltering corner of Southeast Asia. The morning watch had no way of knowing that beneath the routine bustle of maritime logistics, an invisible enemy was already moving into position. The USNS Core represented the lifeline of American helicopter operations in Vietnam. Originally commissioned as CVE-13 during World War II, she had been converted from an escort carrier into a helicopter transport, her flight deck modified to accommodate the disassembled fuselages of Bell UH-1 Huey helicopters. Every 48 to 72 hours, ships like the Core arrived from Subic Bay Naval Base in the Philippines, carrying the components that sustained American air mobility operations throughout Southeast Asia. The logistics were staggering in their complexity. Each helicopter arrived as hundreds of separate components, from main rotor assemblies wrapped in moisture-resistant plastic to delicate avionics systems packed in foam-lined aluminum. Turbine engines came sealed in protective containers with desiccant packets and corrosion-inhibiting coating. Transmission assemblies, tail rotors, hydraulic pumps, and flight control systems all required specialized handling and climate-controlled storage until reassembly at forward maintenance facilities. The JP-4 jet fuel that powered these aircraft presented its own logistical challenges. Stored in 55-gallon drums stacked in precise geometric patterns along the pier, each container held the potential energy equivalent of several hundred pounds of TNT. The fuel required constant temperature monitoring to prevent condensation that could contaminate engine systems operating at 30,000 feet above sea level. Transfer pumps, filtration system, and quality control procedures ensured that the fuel reaching helicopter engines met the exacting specifications required for turbine operation in tropical conditions. Shore cranes rated for 20 tons each lifted pallets of fuel drums from ship to dock with mechanical precision, while teams of Vietnamese stevedores guided the loads with practiced efficiency born of months of repetitive operation. These local workers represented both the necessity and the vulnerability of American logistics in Vietnam. The United States military lacked sufficient personnel to handle the massive cargo throughput required to sustain operations across Southeast Asia. Vietnamese dock workers, truck drivers, crane operators, and warehouse staff provided essential labor that made the entire supply system function. They possessed intimate knowledge of port facilities, shipping schedule, and cargo handling procedures that no American supervisor could match. Many had worked these same docks under French colonial administration through the chaos of partition in 1954, and now under the expanding American military presence. Their expertise was invaluable and irreplaceable. It was also impossible to verify completely. Lieutenant Commander James Mitchell stood on the Core's bridge, reviewing the morning's cargo manifest with the casual confidence of a professional naval officer who had overseen dozens of similar operations. 42 UH-1D helicopters, 630 drums of JP-4, spare parts inventory worth $2.7 million, and enough ammunition to keep the 1st Cavalry airborne for 6 weeks, he reported to the harbour master via radio. The numbers reflected the industrial scale of American military logistics. Entire factories in Texas and Michigan working around the clock to produce the components that fed helicopter operations 8,000 miles away. Executive Officer Lieutenant Danny Walsh wiped perspiration from his forehead with a damp sleeve and laughed. Good thing Charlie doesn't have a navy. The real fighting's happening up in those mountains, not floating around out here in government-controlled waters. The assumption seemed entirely reasonable, based on every intelligence assessment and operational experience to date. The Viet Cong operated primarily as a rural guerrilla force, moving through jungle corridors and mountain sanctuaries where American technology provided maximum advantage to conventional forces. North Vietnamese regular army units concentrated in border areas near Laos and Cambodia, preparing for large-scale operations but lacking the maritime capabilities to threaten major ports defended by South Vietnamese Marines and American Naval Security Detachment. Recent intelligence summaries focused almost exclusively on infiltration routes through the Central Highlands, supply movements along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and the buildup of enemy forces in remote base areas. The possibility of coordinated sabotage against maritime logistics facilities seemed remote, almost anachronistic, in an era defined by helicopter mobility and electronic warfare. But intelligence assessments could not penetrate the patient planning that had been developing in Quy Nhon for months. Among the dock workers preparing to unload helicopter components and aviation fuel, 3 men moved with different purpose and deeper knowledge. Nguyen Van Duc had arrived in the port city 6 months earlier with forged identification papers that identified him as a refugee from a village destroyed during Operation Masha. His background story was carefully constructed and completely plausible. Displacement and economic necessity had driven thousands of rural Vietnamese into urban areas where American military operations provided employment opportunities. What the background checks could not detect was Nguyen's training at a demolition school operated by North Vietnamese sappers in the mountains west of Hanoi, where he had learned to construct improvised explosive devices from common industrial materials and to position charges for maximum psychological and material. His companions, brothers named Tran Minh Duc and Tran Minh Hai, operated a legitimate fishing boat that had been moving through coastal waters between Quy Nhon and Quy Nhon Bay for over a year. Their vessel appeared on harbourmaster records as one of dozens of small craft that supplied fish to military mess halls and local markets. The brothers had established a reputation for reliability and political neutrality, carefully avoiding any associations that might attract security attention. What port authorities did not know was that the fishing boat had been making regular contact with supply networks that moved small quantities of explosives, timing devices, and communications equipment from North Vietnamese agents operating out of supposedly neutral Cambodia. The boat's fish holds contained hidden compartments that could conceal weapons and explosives during routine harbour patrols, while the brothers' extensive knowledge of coastal waters provided escape routes that larger patrol vessels could not follow. Their mission had been planned with the same methodical precision that characterized North Vietnamese military operations throughout the war. Intelligence networks had identified the arrival schedule of American helicopter transports and the layout of fuel storage facilities at Quy Nhon. The objective was not to destroy the entire port or inflict maximum casualties, but to create fires and delays that would reduce American helicopter availability during a crucial period when major combat operations were anticipated in the Central Highlands. Every destroyed aircraft, every gallon of burning fuel, every day of delayed operations would translate into reduced American tactical mobility when the People's Army of Vietnam launched its planned offensive against the newly arrived 1st Cavalry Division operating out of An Khê and Pleiku. The timing was not coincidental. North Vietnamese intelligence had detected the deployment pattern that indicated an imminent large-scale helicopter operation in the Ia Drang Valley, where American forces were attempting to locate and engage main force enemy units for the first time in the war. The success of American airmobile tactics depended entirely on the availability of sufficient helicopter assets to move troops rapidly across difficult terrain while maintaining continuous supply and medical evacuation capabilities. Any significant reduction in helicopter strength would force American commanders to modify their operational concepts, potentially creating opportunities for North Vietnamese forces to achieve tactical surprise against smaller, less mobile American units. As the sun climbed higher over Quy Nhon Harbour, raising the temperature to 96 degrees Fahrenheit with humidity approaching saturation, the saboteurs made their final preparations. Nguyen had spent the previous week identifying optimal target locations throughout the port facility, paying particular attention to fuel storage areas and aircraft assembly hangars, where fires would be most likely to spread rapidly. The plastic explosive charges he positioned were small and carefully camouflaged, designed to appear as the weatherproofing putty commonly used to protect metal surfaces in tropical maritime environments. Each charge contained approximately half a pound of explosive material, sufficient to rupture fuel containers or ignite combustible materials, but not large enough to create crater patterns that would immediately indicate sabotage rather than accidental explosion. The timing devices were mechanical rather than electronic, wind-up mechanisms similar to alarm clocks that could be set to detonate in sequence over a period of several hours. This approach would create the appearance of spreading fires rather than coordinated attacks, potentially delaying recognition of sabotage until the damage was already extensive. The devices had been constructed in North Vietnamese workshops using components that could not be traced to specific sources, incorporating timing mechanisms salvaged from French-manufactured equipment that had been abandoned throughout Indochina after the defeat at Dien Bien Phu. The explosive material itself was a plastic composition that could be molded into any shape and would burn rather than explode if discovered accidentally, providing additional security against premature detection. The Tran brothers had positioned their fishing boat beyond the normal patrol perimeter, but close enough to monitor port activities and respond to emergency signals. Their escape route had been rehearsed multiple times, utilizing shallow water channels that were well known to local fishermen, but too dangerous for larger patrol vessels to navigate safely. Emergency supplies were already loaded aboard the boat, including fuel for extended operation, food and water for several days at sea, and radio equipment for communication with coastal support networks. If the operation succeeded, they would guide Nguyen to a predetermined pickup point and then disappear into the maze of islands and river mouths that formed the complex coastal geography between Quy Nhon and the Cambodian border. At 1400 hours, the afternoon shift of dock workers began the process of unloading helicopter components from the Corps' forward cargo holds. The operation proceeded with mechanical efficiency that reflected months of practice and refinement. Shore cranes lifted standardized shipping containers from the vessel's deck, transferring them to flatbed trucks that would transport the cargo to assembly facilities at Phuket Airfield 15 miles inland. Each container held specific aircraft components. One might contain main rotor assemblies for 6 helicopters, another the avionics systems for an entire squadron, a third the weapons mounting systems that allowed Hueys to carry rockets and machine guns into combat. The containers were color-coded and numbered according to a system that allowed rapid identification and proper sequencing during aircraft reassembly. Fuel handling operations required even greater precision and safety consciousness. The JP-4 aviation fuel was transferred from ship's tanks to shore storage facilities through flexible hoses that eliminated the static electricity buildup that could trigger explosion. Flow rates were carefully controlled to prevent pressure surges that might rupture seals or fittings, while temperature monitoring ensured that thermal expansion would not exceed the capacity of storage tanks ashore. Fire suppression equipment stood ready at every transfer point, with foam dispensers and emergency shut-off valves positioned to contain any accidental spills or ignition sources. The entire operation was supervised by certified petroleum specialists who understood the volatile characteristics of aviation fuel in tropical conditions. Vietnamese stevedores guided each load with practiced skill, their movements economical and precise despite the oppressive heat and humidity that left American personnel exhausted after brief periods of physical labor. These men had adapted to working in temperatures that regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit, maintaining concentration and coordination even when heat indices reached dangerous levels. Their knowledge of cargo handling techniques had been developed through years of experience with everything from rice shipments to construction equipment. But helicopter components represented the most complex and valuable cargo they had ever handled. A single mistake could destroy aircraft worth hundreds of thousands of dollars or create safety hazards that might kill dozens of workers. Among these experienced professionals, Nguyen Van Duc moved with the same apparent routine as his colleagues, but his attention focused on opportunity rather than procedure. Throughout the afternoon, he positioned small explosive charges in locations where fires would be most likely to spread rapidly and cause maximum material damage. A charge placed against a fuel storage tank would create an initial explosion that could ignite adjacent containers in a chain reaction. Another positioned near aircraft components would ensure that fires spread to the most valuable and irreplaceable equipment in the port. The charges were nearly invisible when properly positioned, resembling the weatherproofing materials and corrosion protection compounds that were routinely applied to equipment exposed to salt air and tropical moisture. The placement required detailed knowledge of port layout and cargo handling procedures that Nguyen had acquired through months of careful observation. He understood which areas were monitored by security cameras and which blind spots offered opportunities for undetected sabotage. He knew the shift schedules of American security personnel and the patrol routes followed by South Vietnamese Marines responsible for perimeter defense. Most importantly, he understood the flow patterns of fuel and cargo that would determine how fires might spread from initial ignition points to create maximum destruction with minimum risk of detection during the placement phase. As the afternoon progressed toward evening, normal port operations continued with no indication of the catastrophe being prepared. American personnel focused on maintaining the delivery schedules that kept helicopter operations functioning throughout South Vietnam. Every day of delay in unloading meant corresponding delays in aircraft availability at forward bases, where combat operations depended on reliable logistics support. The pressure to maintain throughput was constant and intense, creating an environment where routine security procedures might be abbreviated or overlooked in the interest of operational efficiency. This tension between security and productivity was inherent in all military logistics operations, but it became particularly acute in Vietnam, where the enemy's presence was often invisible until the moment of attack. The Corps' communications center maintained regular contact with Subic Bay to coordinate the arrival of subsequent supply convoy while simultaneously tracking the cargo being unloaded at Quy Nhon. Each helicopter component and fuel drum was logged according to its ultimate destination. Some equipment would remain at coastal facilities for immediate use by marine aviation units, while other materiel would be transported inland to support army operations in the Central Highlands. The logistics system required precise coordination across hundreds of miles and dozens of different units, with any disruption potentially affecting operations throughout South Vietnam. Radio traffic between ships, ports, and inland bases created a constant background of technical communication that reflected the enormous complexity of sustaining modern military operations in a remote theater of war. By 1800 hours, the day's cargo operations were nearing completion. Most American personnel had secured their equipment and were preparing for the evening meal aboard ship or at shore facility. Vietnamese dock workers completed their final tasks and began departing the port area through security checkpoints that had become routine after months of peaceful operation. The transition from day to night watch proceeded according to established procedures, with responsibility for port security shifting from the predominantly American day shift to mixed American and South Vietnamese night patrols. This transition period represented a brief window of reduced security vigilance as personnel changed shifts and attention focused on administrative rather than operational concerns. Nguyen Van Duc completed his final preparations during this transition period, activating timing devices that would begin the sequence of explosions after he had sufficient time to reach the predetermined escape point. The mechanical timers were set to begin detonating charges at approximately 1940 hours, with subsequent explosions occurring at irregular interval over the following 2 hours. This timing would allow fires to develop and spread before emergency response teams could establish effective control, while also creating the impression of accidental explosions caused by fire spread rather than coordinated sabotage. The irregular timing would complicate efforts to predict where the next explosion might occur, forcing firefighting teams to spread their resources across multiple potential target areas. The fishing boat operated by the Tran brothers had already moved into position beyond the harbor's main channel, maintaining radio silence while monitoring visual signals from the port area. Their vessel appeared as one of dozens of small craft that regularly operated in coastal waters during evening, taking advantage of cooler temperatures and offshore breezes that made fishing more productive than during the heat of midday. Harbor patrol boats paid minimal attention to familiar vessels operated by known local fishermen, particularly during routine evening operations, when attention focused primarily on preventing unauthorized access to port facilities rather than monitoring departing traffic. At 1942 hours, the first explosion shattered the evening calm with a flash of orange light that reflected off low-hanging clouds and sent shockwaves across the harbor. A fuel storage tank ruptured with tremendous force, releasing thousands of gallons of JP-4 aviation fuel that ignited instantly upon contact with the explosion's heat source. The initial fireball climbed 50 feet into the darkening sky, its intense heat visible from ships anchored miles offshore. Within seconds, burning fuel had spread across adjacent storage areas, igniting additional containers in a chain reaction that created multiple fire sources across several hundred yards of pier space. The roar of burning petroleum mixed with the crash of exploding fuel drums and the screaming of emergency sirens as port personnel responded to what initially appeared to be a catastrophic industrial accident. American sailors and Marines ran toward the fire carrying portable extinguishers and emergency foam dispensers, their training taking over despite the obvious inadequacy of handheld equipment against fires of this magnitude. The heat was so intense that approaching within 50 yards became impossible without protective equipment. that was not immediately available. Smoke rose in towering columns that could be seen from aircraft approaching Tan Son Nhut airfield 60 miles to the south, while burning fuel created a lake of fire that spread along the pier's drainage systems and threatened to engulf additional storage areas. Emergency lighting flickered and failed as electrical systems overloaded, leaving large sections of the port in darkness punctuated by the hellish glow of petroleum fires. The second explosion occurred 8 minutes later, destroying a warehouse containing helicopter spare parts and creating new fires that spread rapidly through the building's wooden construction and flammable contents. Transmission assemblies, rotor blades, and engine components worth hundreds of thousands of dollars were consumed in minutes as the fire generated temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The explosion's concussion shattered windows in buildings throughout the port area, while sending debris flying across adjacent piers where additional cargo awaited unloading. A 20-ton shore crane, its boom weakened by heat and shock waves, toppled sideways across the main loading area, crushing 2 Vietnamese dock workers and blocking access to firefighting equipment that had been positioned nearby. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell rushed to the Corps bridge, immediately ordering the ship to prepare for emergency departure from the increasingly dangerous proximity of burning fuel and exploding ammunition. Through binoculars, he watched orange flames reflect off the underside of smoke clouds that rose like thunderheads above the burning port facility. Radio communications filled with emergency traffic as shore stations called for additional firefighting equipment, medical assistance, and security reinforcements to contain what was rapidly becoming the worst logistics disaster in the history of American operations in Vietnam. The harbour master's emergency klaxon wailed across the water, while South Vietnamese patrol boats moved to prevent fires from spreading to other vessels anchored in the harbour. The third explosion destroyed additional fuel storage area and confirmed that the fires were spreading faster than emergency response capabilities could contain them. Ammunition stored in adjacent warehouses began cooking off as temperatures exceeded the ignition point of various explosive material, creating a continuous series of smaller explosions that made firefighting operations extremely hazardous. 20mm cannon rounds and 2 75-inch rockets designed for helicopter weapon systems detonated randomly as their explosive components reached critical temperatures, sending fragments flying across the port area and forcing emergency personnel to maintain dangerous distances from the fires they were attempting to extinguish. During the chaos and confusion of emergency response operations, few personnel noticed a small fishing boat departing the harbour without navigation lights, moving faster than wind and current conditions should have allowed. Lieutenant Walsh spotted the vessel through night vision binoculars from the Corps bridge and immediately radioed the harbour patrol with coordinates and heading information. Suspicious craft departing the port at high speed, bearing 270 degrees, approximately 1,000 meters from the main channel, he reported, but his transmission was partially obscured by emergency radio traffic and the crash of exploding ammunition that continued to detonate throughout the port area. South Vietnamese swift boats responded to the alert, their twin diesel engines roaring to life as crews attempted to pursue the fleeing vessel into darkness beyond the harbour entrance. The patrol boats were faster than any fishing craft and equipped with searchlights and radar systems that should have made escape impossible for any vessel attempting to flee the area. But the fishing boats' operators possessed intimate knowledge of coastal waters that no amount of technology could match. Using channels known only to fishermen who had worked these waters for generations, the Tran brothers guided their vessel through shallow areas where larger patrol boats could not safely operate, utilizing tide patterns and underwater obstacles that were invisible to pursuing forces operating under emergency conditions. By midnight, the boat had vanished into the maze of islands, river mouths, and tidal channels that formed the complex coastal geography between Quy Nhon and the Cambodian border. Aerial reconnaissance aircraft launched from Da Nang began searching coastal areas at first light, but their infrared sensors and photographic equipment could not distinguish one fishing boat from the hundreds of similar vessels that operated throughout the region. The saboteurs had successfully melted back into the civilian population, indistinguishable from legitimate fishermen who provided essential protein sources for both military and civilian communities throughout South Vietnam. The fires at Quy Nhon burned through the night, their glow visible from aircraft approaching coastal airfields throughout the region. Emergency response teams from other ports arrived to assist with specialized foam compounds and heavy equipment designed to contain petroleum fires that had proven resistant to water and conventional firefighting methods. The heat was so intense that steel structures warped and aluminum melted, creating toxic fumes that forced firefighters to work in protective equipment, despite temperatures that exceeded human endurance limits. The damaged shore crane required cutting torches and heavy lifting equipment to clear, blocking access to undamaged cargo areas where additional aircraft components and supplies remained trapped behind twisted metal and collapsed structures. Dawn revealed the full scope of the destruction that had been accomplished by 3 men with less than 10 pounds of explosive material and detailed knowledge of port operation. 18 UH-1D helicopters had been destroyed while still in shipping containers, their components scattered and burned beyond any possibility of salvage or repair. 430 drums of JP-4 aviation fuel had been consumed in the fires, representing enough energy to power helicopter operations for several weeks. Critical spare parts worth over $2 million had been reduced to twisted metal and ash, including transmission assembly, engine components, and avionics systems that required months to manufacture and could not be rapidly replaced in inventory. The intelligence assessment that arrived from Saigon within 12 hours confirmed what port security personnel had begun to suspect during the night. Enemy agents had successfully infiltrated the port's workforce and executed a coordinated sabotage designed to degrade American helicopter operations precisely when those aircraft were most needed for major combat operations in the Central Harbor. North Vietnamese radio intercepts confirmed the mission's success through coded messages referring to sky blindness and grounded birds, terminology that intelligence analysts recognized as references to disabled American aviation assets. The timing of the attack was not coincidental, but represented careful coordination with broader military operations planned by North Vietnamese forces. For the soldiers and aircrew of the 1st Cavalry Division, already deployed to forward bases at An Khe and Pleiku in preparation for operations in the Ia Drang Valley, the port fires translated into immediate operational constraints that would affect every aspect of the coming battle. Helicopters that should have been relieved after reaching maximum flight hour limitations continued operating beyond safe margins because replacement aircraft were no longer available. Maintenance schedules were compressed and critical repairs postponed as technicians struggled to keep damaged aircraft operational with improvised solutions and cannibalized parts. Pilots learned to listen for subtle changes in engine tone that might indicate impending mechanical failure, while crew chiefs became expert at field repairs that would normally require factory-level facilities. The tactical implications of the Quy Nhon sabotage rippled outward from the burning port to jungle landing zones, where American soldiers would soon fight the first major helicopter-borne battle in military history. Major Bruce Crandall, Captain Ed Freeman, and dozens of other pilots found themselves flying mission after mission without adequate maintenance support, their aircraft running on determination and improvised repairs as ammunition supplies and medical evacuation capabilities reached critically low levels. The air mobility tactics that defined American operations in Vietnam depended entirely on the availability of sufficient helicopter assets to move troops rapidly across difficult terrain while maintaining continuous logistical support. Any significant reduction in aircraft availability forced commanders to modify their operational concepts and potentially created opportunities for enemy forces to achieve tactical advantages. The strategic significance of the attack extended far beyond the immediate material losses at Quy Nhon. North Vietnamese planners had demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of American operational methods and identified vulnerabilities in the logistics systems that sustained modern military operations. They had learned that attacking American supply lines could be more effective than engaging American combat units directly, particularly when those attacks were timed to coincide with major operations that demanded maximum equipment availability. The port fires proved that the enemy possessed detailed intelligence about American shipping schedules, cargo handling procedures, and security arrangements that enabled them to plan and execute complex sabotage operations with devastating effect. In the weeks following the sabotage, port security protocols throughout South Vietnam underwent massive revision and expansion. Vietnamese workers faced extensive background investigations and constant supervision during all cargo handling operations. American naval intelligence established permanent surveillance of harbor activities, monitoring not just obvious security threats, but the subtle patterns of daily routine that might conceal enemy preparation for future attacks. Motion sensors, underwater detection equipment, and expanded patrol schedules were implemented to prevent maritime infiltration attempts, while cargo inspection procedures were enhanced to detect concealed explosive devices before they could be positioned in vulnerable locations. The cost of implementing these security measures began to rival the cost of the materiel being protected, creating economic burdens that affected the entire logistics system supporting American operations in Southeast Asia. Additional security personnel required housing, food, and equipment that diverted resources from combat operations, increased inspection procedures, slowed cargo handling, and created delays that affected delivery schedules throughout the region. Background investigations of Vietnamese personnel consumed intelligence resources that might otherwise have been focused on enemy military capabilities and operational planning. The port fires had achieved strategic effects far beyond their immediate material impact by forcing the Americans to divert substantial resources to defensive measures. Yet the deeper lesson of Quy Nhon echoed through every subsequent American military operation in Vietnam and influenced logistics planning for decades afterward. Modern warfare could not be won solely through superior firepower, advanced technology, and tactical mobility. For every helicopter that lifted wounded soldiers from jungle landing zones, a supply chain stretched back across thousands of miles through multiple countries and numerous potential failure points. Each link in that chain represented a target for an enemy that understood asymmetric warfare with sophisticated precision and was willing to strike where defenses were weakest rather than where they were strongest. The North Vietnamese had recognized that American military superiority depended on the continuous flow of supplies, spare parts, fuel, and ammunition from industrial facilities in the United States, through maritime choke points and vulnerable ports to forward bases throughout South Vietnam. Disrupting this flow at any point could create effects that multiplied throughout the entire system, potentially neutralizing American technological advantages through patient application of force against logistics vulnerabilities. The port fires demonstrated that 3 determined saboteurs with detailed knowledge and minimal equipment could achieve results that might require entire enemy divisions to accomplish through conventional military action. As wreckage was cleared from Quy Nhon Harbor and new helicopters arrived to replace those destroyed in the fires, the men aboard subsequent convoy ships carried a burden of knowledge that changed their understanding of the war they were supporting. Every dock worker was now a potential security threat. Every routine cargo transfer carried the possibility of sabotage. Every fuel drum and aircraft component represented a target that enemy agents might have already identified and planned to attack. The innocence of rear area operations had been shattered by the realization that there were no truly safe areas in a conflict where the enemy might be the man guiding your crane or the fisherman selling food to your mess hall. Commander Mitchell's final log entry regarding the Quy Nhon incident captured the transformation in American military thinking that resulted from the sabotage. Port security procedures upgraded to maximum alert status. All Vietnamese personnel subject to armed escort and continuous observation. Future helicopter shipments will require expanded security details throughout unloading and transport operations. The enemy has demonstrated capability to strike our supply lines with devastating effect. We must assume that every logistics facility is a potential target and plan accordingly. The bureaucratic language could not convey the psychological impact of realizing that safety was an illusion and that the war followed American forces even into supposedly secure areas where the greatest previous concerns had been tropical disease, equipment corrosion, and administrative efficiency. The broader strategic implications became increasingly clear as intelligence reports accumulated from ports and supply bases throughout South Vietnam. The Quy Nhon attack was not an isolated incident, but part of a coordinated campaign against American logistics infrastructure that extended from the DMZ to the Mekong Delta. Similar sabotage attempts had been detected at Da Nang, Cam Ranh Bay, Vung Tau, and smaller facilities along the coast. Enemy agents had infiltrated civilian workforces at multiple locations, gathering intelligence about shipping schedule, cargo handling procedures, and security arrangements that enabled them to plan coordinated attacks designed to maximize disruption of American military operations. For helicopter crews preparing to deploy into the Ia Drang Valley, the shortage of replacement aircraft meant accepting risks that would have been considered unacceptable under normal circumstances. Hueys designed for specific maintenance intervals and operational limitations continued flying with jury-rigged repairs and improvised solutions that pushed both machines and crews beyond their design specifications. Pilots learned to compensate for equipment malfunctions that should have grounded their aircraft, while door gunners and crew chiefs became amateur mechanics, capable of performing field maintenance that normally required specialist facilities and trained technicians. The entire 1st Cavalry Division adapted to operating with degraded equipment availability, developing improvisation skills and operational flexibility that would become characteristic of American forces throughout the Vietnam conflict. Units learned to accomplish missions with fewer resources and less reliable equipment than their doctrine assumed would be available. Maintenance personnel became expert at cannibalization techniques that kept some aircraft operational by using parts from others that were beyond immediate repair. Supply officers developed informal networks that could locate critical components through channels that bypassed normal procurement procedures. The psychological burden of the port fires fell most heavily on support personnel, who understood how the loss of those 18 helicopters would affect combat operations hundreds of miles from Chinon. Every delayed medical evacuation, every supply mission that could not be, every tactical movement that required walking instead of flying could be traced back to the explosions that had consumed irreplaceable equipment in a few hours of coordinated destruction. The men loading replacement aircraft onto subsequent convoy ships carried the weight of knowing that their efficiency and security consciousness directly determined whether American soldiers would live or die in jungle battles that most support personnel would never see. There was no glory in moving cargo from ships to trucks, no recognition for maintaining inventory records or inspecting fuel quality, no medals for detecting security threats before they could materialize into attacks. But there was profound responsibility that connected every logistics operation to combat effectiveness and soldier survival. The port fires had made this connection brutally clear, eliminating any illusions that rear area personnel were somehow insulated from the life and death consequences of warfare. Every Clark and crane operator, every security guard and fuel handler, every dock worker and truck driver had become a participant in a conflict where seemingly routine decisions could determine the outcome of battles fought far from ports and supply depots. Years later, when military historians analyzed the Ia Drang campaign and its broader significance in the evolution of helicopter warfare, they would note how logistics vulnerabilities shaped tactical outcomes throughout the battle. The helicopter shortage caused by the Quy Nhon fires forced American commanders to concentrate their limited aviation assets in decisive areas, leading to the intense fighting at Landing Zone X-Ray and Landing Zone Albany that became emblematic of the entire Vietnam conflict. What might have been a series of smaller engagements distributed across a wider area became concentrated battle because insufficient aircraft were available to maintain the dispersed operations that airmobile doctrine had originally envisioned. The North Vietnamese had achieved strategic effects through tactical sabotage, demonstrating an understanding of American operational methods that would influence the conduct of the war for years to come. They had learned that attacking American logistics was more effective than engaging American combat units directly, particularly when those attacks were coordinated with major operations that demanded maximum equipment availability. This lesson would be applied repeatedly throughout the conflict, from the coordinated attacks against airfields during the Tet Offensive to the systematic targeting of supply convoys and fuel depots that characterized the later phases of American involvement in Southeast Asia. The fishing boat that escaped from Quy Nhon Harbor was never located, despite extensive searches that continued for months after the sabotage. Intelligence agencies tracked rumors of the crew through underground networks that connected coastal villages to mountain sanctuaries, but the trail disappeared in the complex maze of rivers, canals, and tidal channels that formed South Vietnam's intricate waterway system. The men who had executed the sabotage melted back into the civilian population with the same invisibility that had enabled them to infiltrate the port's workforce months earlier. Their success became a model for similar operations throughout the war, proof that small groups of dedicated saboteurs with detailed knowledge and careful planning could achieve effects far beyond their numbers or equipment. The port of Quy Nhon was eventually rebuilt with enhanced security measures and more sophisticated detection equipment, but the vulnerability had been exposed and the lesson absorbed by both sides. New helicopters replaced those destroyed in the fires, and improved procedures reduced the likelihood of similar attack. But American forces never again operated with the assumption that logistics facilities were inherently secure, or that rear areas were immune from enemy action. The war had demonstrated that modern conflicts recognize no boundaries between combat and support, between battlefield and supply depot, between military and civilian personnel who might conceal hostile intentions behind facades of cooperation and normalcy. The smoke from those November fires rose into the South China Sea air and dispersed on monsoon winds, but the memory remained embedded in the institutional consciousness of American military forces. The age of clearly defined front lines and secure rear areas had ended at Queenon, replaced by a conflict where every supply operation became a potential target and every civilian worker represented both essential capability and possible security threat. Modern warfare demanded not just battlefield courage and tactical skill, but comprehensive security awareness and constant vigilance against enemies who were patient enough to spend months preparing single attacks and sophisticated enough to understand that disrupting logistics could be more effective than winning battle. The men who loaded subsequent convoy ships and unloaded their cargo at Vietnamese carried forward the knowledge that had been purchased with 18 destroyed helicopters and the lives of men who had believed they were beyond the reach of enemy action. Every container that came ashore, every fuel truck that moved toward inland bases, every aircraft that was reassembled from shipping components represented both the industrial might that sustained American operations and the vulnerability that made those operations possible. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere, patient and ruthless, willing to strike where defenses were weakest and responses would be most difficult to coordinate. History is not made of victories. It's made of voices that refuse to disappear. What should we cover next? Subscribe and share your thoughts on this video. Your feedback and support are immensely valuable and help me keep improving the content.